Today, we're going to talk about leverage tokens. This is going to be the start of the podcast where we go and deep dive more into the very specific case studies and examples. I think I've covered enough of the fundamentals that now we can move on to a bit more application approach and application episodes. Today is going to be on leverage tokens. It's a new token design that's in the space, and I think it's very interesting. The product is quite complicated because it's not as easy as a secondary market determinant on supply and demand to give its value, but there are a lot of intrinsic variables and factors that give the asset value, which is also very different from stablecoins where you're just doing a one-to-one peg, but this is a different form of peg tokens. So I want to dive a little bit more into the economics of leverage tokens, and let's get started. Today we'll cover 5 things. What is leverage token? This is still a very new thing, and I've done some quick research. It's either quite technical or it's going to be just a regurgitation of whatever that's online and on an article form. So it's not very informative, it's not very value adding, so I thought I would just bring in this side of the economic explanation. Then we have the types of token functions, because before we understand what tokens are, how to design the tokens, the economics of these tokens, it's important to understand what kind of functions that they have and what's the main function it holds, so that you can better design the kind of objective function and embed the programming codes into the tokens. 3, we're going to look at the different token design and token types, because this will give you a better understanding of why we're going to focus on leverage tokens and why this economics of leverage tokens is completely different from things like governance token, utility tokens, and all the other kind of token designs available out there. Then we're going to go into the economics of leverage tokens. We're going to use the token economics framework, and I'm going to give you a recap in a little bit during that chapter. And lastly, we're going to figure out how to apply this to your project. So let's get started with leverage tokens 101. I know this podcast series is not for traders or not for investors. It's more for long-term investors and more for project creators, project entrepreneurs, or crypto entrepreneurs, where you're building and designing your ecosystem and building and designing your product. But I still want to warn that leverage tokens is a high-risk product. Why? Because there are a lot of different things that will affect the pricing. It's not as simple as a supply-demand in secondary market to give it value, but there are a lot of other things that's embedded into the token. The cool thing about tokens is that it's programmable, but because it's programmable, there are a lot of other risks involved. So in leverage tokens, we're talking about volatility drag, we're talking about volatility decay or beta slippage. We're talking about price movements of the token, premiums, funding rates, the movements of the futures, or interest rates exposures. There are a lot of factors that will affect the pricing of this token. The thing is, because this is not a simple token that is like a governance token or other native tokens, protocol tokens, that just helps to facilitate transactions. It is a peg token. It's a form of security. It comes from the underlying asset that gives it value. So there are a lot of other small little things that will affect the pricing. In fact, the pricing will come from internal volatility, internal factors giving it price, and not so much of the external volatility and external factors, which is a very important thing that we're going to dive in later. So let's get started with a quick crash course. We're going to get started with the who, what, when, where, why, how, to give you a basic idea. Then we're going to dive deeper into it so that your mind has a way to go and understand what I'm talking about. So who issues these tokens? These are derivatives exchange like BitMEX, FTX. Binance used to do that. They don't do it anymore. They issue these derivative tokens, these leverage tokens. What is that? Instead of managing a leverage position, you tokenize this position into a token. So this token gives you leverage exposure, gives you leverage position. That's it. Where do you get access? You get access on your various exchanges. So an example would be FTX, BitMEX. If you go to leveragetokens.com, there are a lot of other exchanges that gives you this asset because it represents a leverage position, but because it's an ERC20 token, it's also traded in the spot market. When do you use it? When you want to increase exposure to the market. It's best to use during short term, because when you have leverage tokens in the long term, you increase your volatility drag, which is not a very good thing for your underlying asset, your net asset value. And how do you use it? There are three ways to use it, but the easiest way is to just purchase it on the spot market to get leverage exposure. So with that basic who, what, when, where, why, how in mind, let's get a bit more detailed. Who issues it? Who issues it? It really depends on the creation and redemption mechanism, which is something that is also part of the token design. Let's take an example of FTX versus Binance, because these are two, Binance used to create its own leverage tokens. So these are two companies or projects that have leverage tokens, or used to have. And who issues it, it's really dependent on the token design. So these are two case studies I'm going to bring up because these are two different types of issuance. For FTX, anyone can create and redeem. Think of it as MakerDAO, where you can give your collaterals in terms of Ether or USDT or USDC, and it will mint DAI. So in the same concept, for FTX, it's the same thing. Anyone can mint and create and redeem leverage tokens. With Binance, it's slightly different. With Binance, it's really, they look at themselves as lender of last resort kind of thing, where they are the only one issuing and they're going to create leverage tokens anytime they want. It's a bit less transparent. And I want to highlight again that Binance no longer has its own leverage token. It doesn't create its own. You can get Binance leverage tokens on FTX, but not on the Binance platform. So based on that, these are two different tokens with two different kind of redemption and creation mechanism. But at the end of the day, who issues that is still the derivatives exchange issuing it. So what are leverage tokens then? They're ERC20 tokens. That means it interacts on your MetaMask wallet, it interacts on your crypto wallet. It also interacts on the different ERC or different Ethereum exchanges. So you can trade and transfer very easily. You can do your self-custody. It gives you leverage exposure to the market, as I mentioned. And for most of the leverage tokens, they usually give you 3 times exposure, which is the usual leverage exposure. Because they tokenize the leverage exposure, they tokenize the management of having this exposure, it's very easy now to have a long or short position. And everything, all the mathematics that is needed to give you that long or short position is all embedded into token, which is why tokens are interesting because they have programmable codes in there to help you to maintain a specific objective. And this specific objective in leverage token is to give you 3 times exposure. It can be up or down, or long or short. Long or short, but it's always fixed as a 3 times exposure. So think about it as it's similar to having a leverage position. But the thing is, instead of manually changing, manually affecting your exposure, it does that automatically in the code itself. So that's why it's interesting. There are a couple of types of leverage tokens. In general, it's 2 main ones. It's up or down. So, or long or short. Long means you bet that prices go up. So you think that a bull market is coming. Short means that you think that a bear market is coming and you bet that the prices are going down. There are also 2 other types on FTX. It really depends on what kind of exchanges and what kind of exposure that these derivatives exchange are giving you. But the 2 other types on FTX is hedge and half. So hedging is where when prices go up in the long run, you will lose that in the same proportion in the leverage token value. And half means you just increase your exposure by half. There can be other types of leverage tokens, different types of leverage tokens. I've not seen more. I've just seen long, short, hedge, and half. For long and short, the difference is that usually you just have 3 times leverage, but some tokens that I've seen have 10 times leverage. So it's good that it gives you more exposure, but it also gives you tremendously more risks. When do you use it? You use it especially when you're an experienced trader. You want to get exposure to price direction and momentum. You want automatic rebalancing because it's very tedious and laborious to keep having that 3 times leverage position. So it does this automatically every single day. And if you know where the market is moving and you want to bet on the market, there are a few ways to bet on the market. Leverage is one of them. Options is one of them. You can even go to Augur and do actual betting. And so this is just one of the tools to be betting. So why do we use it? There are a few benefits to using it, but then again, I will caution that it comes with high risks. So it's easy to manage a leverage position. You don't need to manage the admin of managing a leverage position. It reduces liquidation risk. So we're going to talk about that a bit later, but basically when you have a leverage position and you're not managing it manually, when prices drop, it drops by 3 times. But because it rebalances, it's programmed to rebalance in the token itself. It helps you to reduce your liquidation risk. It helps you to hedge your losses. It also automatically rebalances, not just at the end of the day to make it 3 times, but during intraday, if your exposure is like 4 times, then it will also automatically rebalance at that time. It remains constant leverage, so it's good to get a leverage position. You don't have to do the whole thing of keep editing your position. You can manage the risk, or the risk is being managed in the programmable code itself. And it's an ERC20 token, so you get to do self-custody, you get to custodize with a hard wallet or something else. But more importantly, it gives you compounded leverage. And compounded leverage is very, very good during bull period. So compounded leverage is anytime this leverage tokens, if they gain additional value or net asset value, it goes back into your position. And so your position you will have more exposure. Not the 3 times exposure, but you have more of the underlying assets that gives you better exposure. So if you're talking about a bull market, and every day 1, day 2, day 3, the market is increasing by 5%, then you're taking 5% compounded 3 days, and not just 5% as a static traditional managed leverage position. So that's the cool thing. But it also goes in the other way. If you're losing 5% and gaining 5% the next day, you will have a volatility drag, a beta slippage because of the rebalancing. We're going to talk about that a bit later. So if we take a snapshot of what FTX is doing for the past few days, you'll see that I charted a graph of 3 things. One is the 3 times long token, so ETH bull. So ETH bull is that you're betting that Ethereum goes up. You're longing Ethereum and that you bet that the Ethereum market goes up, and then you have 3 times exposure. That's the blue line. And then you also have the green line. The green line is the current spot rate of ETH and USD exchange rate. And the orange reddish line is the futures. So it's a perpetuous futures on Ethereum that's on FTX. And you can see the relationship. The perpetual futures and the spot rate it's very highly correlated. But you can see that the exposure given by the leverage token is so much more. It amplifies the curves and it amplifies the volatility that Ethereum is looking at. So this is just to give you an idea of what leverage tokens are and what kind of exposure they're giving you. How do you get it? I mentioned just now that there are 3 ways. The easiest way is to just get it on the spot market because it's ERC20. It's tradable on a lot of Ethereum platforms and a lot of derivatives exchange. So you can just trade it on the spot market. The second way is to create, so you can convert your coins into leverage tokens on FTX. Different exchanges have different methods, but I choose FTX as an example because they really specialize in leverage tokens and they have a bit more explanation and transparency of how to get your different leverage tokens and how the leverage tokens mathematics are and what kind of codes is programmed into the tokens. And the third one is to create and redeem your leverage tokens. So now let's get to part 2, token functions. Token functions are very important because they give us an idea of what are we supposed to program or what kind of rules that are embedded into the tokens that can be programmed into code or that can be coded into the token. So that's why that's very important. And this table is the sums of token functions. I talked about token functions many times, and this table has gone through 3 iterations. So in 2020, with new tokens out in the market, I've edited this table slightly to take in more information and more innovation that's out there in the market. So this table sums up the token functions, S, U, M, S. S is for security, U is for utility, M is for money, and S is for stable coin or stable token. But it's more of a peg token than stable token because it's only stable relative to the underlying collateral or underlying peg. So a peg token would be a better word for it. but I wanted the acronym of SUMS, so I just used stable token. For security, its purpose is really to represent the underlying asset. If you look at different assets available, there are a lot of physical traded projects or physically traded securities, and they're traded but not on blockchain. So the way to take them in is to tokenize them and to put them on blockchain. And these are security tokens because they represent the underlying asset. It derives its value from its valuation is pegged to the underlying asset. And its feature is that it's a tradable asset. Now you can trade it not just on a physical trade, but also on blockchain. An example would be something like a property token. So I've got a house and I tokenize the house so that you get to own tokenized versions of the house. Security tokens are usually also NFTs, so non-fungible tokens. And that's why it's tradable and you can't really replicate it. It's very unique on its own. The second function is a utility. So a utility token, the main function is to assess the internal network. There are a lot of different types of utility token, and it mainly comes from the valuation of the internal usage of the system. And the function is that it's only going to be transacted within the ecosystem. There are different types of utility tokens, like transaction tokens, governance tokens. Transaction tokens would be like Ethereum gas, where you're using it, it's a token. Its utility is to allow for transactions on the Ethereum network. You have governance token like your comp, BAL, MKR. These are governance tokens where it's really done to assess the internal network, to affect changes in the internal network. And then the other one is also collateral tokens. So you have stuff like SNX. They're used as collaterals on the SNX ecosystem. So it's really used within the ecosystem. And the third one is money, or a currency kind of token. For that, it's really used as a means of payment. They can be pegged or not pegged, whatever. The whole purpose is that it's used as a currency, is used for payments, is for store of value, your typical currency functions. It derives its value either two ways. One is via the market, so supply and demand on secondary market, and that's how you get your valuation, or via debt. By debt, I mean IOU. So that could be a pet token or collaterals. So they're basically debt, using debt to create tokens. And this works in a lot of central banks around the world these days because they're creating money by having debt. An example would be Tether or Ripple. You can say whatever you want to say about these projects, but I'm just giving you the functions of it. These are payment projects, or these are currency functions, and they have debt either via having money in the bank, and so that's debt to issue new tokens, or having different IOU statements. So these are how it gets its value. And a function is really to interact. It's a currency to interact between on-chain and off-chain transactions and information. And lastly, we're going to talk about stable coin or stable token. Once again, it's pegged token. It's only stable relative to the underlying asset. So the whole purpose is that you want to reduce volatility in the external market. So you want to reduce external volatility. That means to create stable tokens, it's a bit more complicated because you have to design the right kind of programmable code into the token so that its value really comes from whatever the code is, than just a secondary market volatility or secondary market valuation. And that's why it's quite big in the space when you talk about stable coin, as in a one-to-one peg to whatever currency is out there. But if you think about it, leverage tokens are also pegged tokens because they're pegged to 3 times leverage on the underlying asset. And this is where it gets interesting because that's where the whole rebalancing and mathematics of rebalancing comes in, so that we can maintain this peg of 3 times no matter what. At the end of the day, we want stable tokens, or we want pegged tokens, because the main feature is that its price level is controlled. It's controlled by the underlying asset and by whatever programmable code it's there in the tokens. So this is very interesting. So now that sums up the token functions of 4 different functions: security, utility, money, and stable tokens. As I mentioned again, leverage tokens are stable tokens, are pegged tokens. Because I know there are 4 different functions, and if you look at your token design, they can have more than one function. For example, a security and a stable token are 2 different functions, or a currency and a stable tokens are two different functions. The thing is, there is only going to be one main function you want to have as an objective when you're talking about the mathematical programmable code in your tokens. And in leverage tokens perspective, we're talking about the pegged feature, which is the 3 times exposure or 3 times leverage, which is very different from just being a security. So that being said, now let's move on to part 3, which is the token design. Token design is very interesting because there are different types of tokens. There are different types of token functions. That's why we have different types of token design. As much as I want to say that we can just use one mathematical model and apply to all types of tokens, it really depends on the token functions, which also depends on the token design. There are a couple of token design categories, and just to name it, you have governance tokens, utility tokens, collateral tokens, transaction tokens, currency tokens, stable pegged tokens, reputation tokens, and leverage tokens that we're going to talk about today. So these are the various examples of tokens out there. And if there's any token that you're interested in, just comment down below so I can do a deep dive and a case study. And today we're going to focus on leverage tokens. So the economics of leverage tokens. Now we come to the main part of this episode, which is the economics of leverage tokens. If we take a look back at the token economics framework, just a quick refresher. There are 3 different pillars. You've got market design, mechanism design, and token design. Market design is really the design of the environment where your tokens and your participants will transact and interact with. That's not what we're going to talk about today. Mechanism design is the rules of the game. It's the rules that's embedded into your ecosystem to affect different behaviors. So these are incentive mechanisms. These are governance mechanisms. They're very important, but we're not talking about it today as well. We're talking about the third pillar, token design. Token design looks at how you design the token. And because we talked about the different kind of token designs before, governance tokens, protocol tokens, reputation tokens, because we're talking about leverage tokens, some of these factors in token design will be relevant, some of them will not. So a quick refresher for token design, we're talking about 3 main categories. The first one is token policy, second is financial incentives, and third is architecture. For token policy, we're looking at the monetary policy and the valuation. So this is really more, your supply, your demand, your creation, your redemption, your internal factors that gives it value, and that's all part of token policy. The second is financial incentives. So we're looking at platform activities or returns to investment or returns to stake. And lastly, we're talking about architecture. Architecture is more useful for security tokens and more useful for non-fungible tokens. So it might and might not be so relevant. In architecture, we talk about property rights and distribution. So how the architecture of the token design. So with that being said, we'll get started with the different factors in token design to explain leverage tokens. So let's get started with token policy. We're going to talk about supply, distribution, rebalancing volatility, and leverage. For the supply, as I mentioned, it's created and redeemed based on the demand of the users. So there is no fixed supply. In fact, because it's pegged, its supply is ongoing based on whatever demand of creation or redemption there is over there. So there is no fixed supply. The supply is just out there. You can get the supply via if you use Etherscan and you check the different wallets available on the different derivatives exchange, they will tell you how many token supply there is for the leverage tokens. It's quite transparent. The second is the distribution of token allocation. This is quite different from inflation distribution that you see from a lot of utility tokens. But distribution of token allocation for leverage token really comes from the demand of people. And if you demand more, you will just get your leverage tokens. The other thing about token allocation is that remember you have the 3 times leverage exposure because every token represents a 3 times leverage. When you have more or less than your 3 times leverage, it doesn't mean that you're gaining or losing tokens. It just means that the tokens will rebalance. We're going to talk about the math later. But the tokens will rebalance so that your tokens will always have 3 times exposure. This is not about distribution of tokens. This is not about inflation distribution. But you will always have the amount of your leverage tokens, and you will not have more or less. It will just redistribute the underlying asset to give you the 3 times leverage. So distribution of token allocation here is not the inflation distribution that we talk about in a lot of utility tokens. Then now we talk about rebalancing. So rebalancing is really about the exposure. I keep talking about the 3 times exposure because the three times is the usual leverage position that people have in trade anyway. And we're talking about exposure in two ways. One, or rebalancing in two ways. One is a fixed day. So every day at, I think, 2 minutes past midnight at UTC timing, it rebalances. It automatically rebalances based on the programmable math that's already in the token to give you the 3 times leverage. And that is during the day. If you have more than 3 times, let's say it's 4 times leverage, it gives you too much exposure. You want to limit that. That's the whole point of this leverage tokens. It removes the admin of you having to manually rebalance that. It rebalances that automatically for you. So during intraday, it will also rebalance. The thing about token, this leverage tokens I'm talking about, is that it has a fixed exposure, which is your 3 times exposure. You can also, once again, design different types of exposure. Maybe a mathematical formula which gives you more variables, so individuals get to choose the kind of exposure that they want. Maybe they only want 2.5 times exposure, they get to choose that. They get to have the formula out, programmed into their tokens to give them exposure. That could be possible. It's going to be more complicated, and that's why right now it's a fixed exposure that's already embedded and hard-coded into the tokens. In the future, we can probably see more innovation when it comes to your exposure level. Then we're going to talk, then also there's also volatility. Of course, volatility here, I'm not talking about the usual volatility of utility tokens and money tokens. For volatility, I'm talking about volatility drag and volatility slippage. So volatility drag happens, these tokens are not really meant for the long run. It's not, you don't really hold it for the long term because it gives you too much exposure because of the rebalancing, constant rebalancing and the fees that you have to pay. You're just losing some value in, like some monetary value in your assets. So you don't really want to hold it long term. Volatility will affect that. We talk about volatility decay, which is your beta slippage. It happens because these, as I mentioned, these leverage are compounded. So they're compounded and rebalance all the time to reduce your risk. Because of that, you also have beta slippage, which is I call it a dead weight loss. I think the finance people call it a different way, but in economics, I call it a dead weight loss because it's a loss that you have compared to a perfect market, compared to a traditional leverage token. So for example, if the value drops 5%, increase 5%, drops 3%, increase 6%, the token rebalances because of it's programmed to do so, to reduce your exposure when it drops. But because it reduces your exposure when it drops, you have less underlying asset. So when it rises again, you have less exposure and you gain less. Compared to a static position, it doesn't rebalance and it just has exposure based on the fixed underlying asset. And so at the end of the day, you have different kind of returns. So that's called beta slippage. And that's one of the things that will happen. I guess you could find ways to reduce beta slippage, but that's a whole new level of that's a different type of financial engineering that haven't been explored yet, but could be an alternative in the future. Then, as I mentioned, for leverage, you have a fixed and variable leverage. Right now, it's all fixed leverage because it's a lot easier. If you have if you have variable leverage, so if my leverage is 2 times, someone else is 3 times, someone else is 5 times, then you can't have all of them as the same ERC20 token. And so it's going to be more complicated and it will affect liquidity. And that's why this is quite different from a leverage position, because a leverage position is not tradable, it's just a position, and it gives you the freedom of having variable leverage. Because this is a fixed token, this is tradable, you need to have fixed leverage so that it can be traded and have a united valuation. So now let's talk about valuation. The thing about, when I talk about valuation in the token economics model or token economics framework, it's endogenous valuation. That means valuation that comes from within the ecosystem, within the token itself. You can have external valuation, which is in the secondary market where you are speculating it. That is not accounted for in the token design. Because when we're talking about token design, we're talking about the internal variables that we can control as designers, as your crypto project owners, and how do we affect the endogenous valuation. The good thing about endogenous valuation is that it reduces speculation and it reduces arbitrage in the secondary market. Once again, endogenous valuation doesn't come all the time. It only comes from specific token functions and token design. For valuation, we're talking about a few things. We're talking about the net asset value. So it's a value fixed within your tokens. This net asset value is your underlying asset and the valuation of the underlying asset. So what the leverage token represents. It represents 3 times leverage or 3 times the exposure of your net asset value. So that's pretty much fixed. You can calculate it, it shifts, but it doesn't shift so much. Then you have your leverage token price. So the leverage token itself gives you 3 times leverage. That's a fact. But the price itself is slightly different because it's traded on the derivatives market. And so it has a secondary exposure. And so prices can change slightly. But prices wouldn't change that much because it's really constrained by the futures price, the spot price, the market expectations, a lot of other different factors. So technically it shouldn't change so much because if there is a big volatility or big shift or big change, then arbitrageurs will come in or high frequency traders will come in to minimize the difference. Then the valuation also comes from price movement of the underlying asset. So your price movements of the spot market asset and the futures asset, because when we talk about redemption and creation of all these assets, it will affect it has a secondary effect or a much bigger impact, which is buying and selling of the futures contract. It affects the futures. The futures will have more or less supply based on your position, based on your long or short position, and then it will affect the current prices as well. So there are a lot of different small little parts that affects the endogenous valuation of the leverage tokens. Also, valuation doesn't just come from the value itself. Valuation also comes from the revaluation part. So there are a lot of revaluation that will affect the perpetual futures that these tokens are being pegged to. So like your slippage rate, or your fees. There are a lot of different fees available that we'll talk about later. And every single day with the revaluation being done, or any time during intraday that there's revaluation, you have to pay different fees. And when you revaluate, you will also experience slippage fees. The other fun thing that I also realized is that leverage tokens only have intrinsic value. So they are not like options market or options where you have intrinsic value and extrinsic value. Leverage tokens really primarily just have intrinsic value because value just comes from the underlying asset and the exposure that you have. The other thing though, when we talk about risk of valuation is, as I mentioned, high frequency traders and arbitrageurs. Not just arbitrageurs and high frequency traders during price differences, but more of the risk of front running. So front running is when you're going to rebalance, and then you're going to go into the market, into the order books to buy and sell your assets during your entire rebalancing process. And since this rebalance is done every single day at a specific time, high frequency traders and arbitrageurs could come in to take advantage of this information. So let's talk a little bit more about rebalancing and the math involved in rebalancing, because at the end of the day, the fun part about token design is that you can program it, you can turn them into code and embed it into your tokens. So let's take an example of we're gonna bet that market is going up. So we have ETH bull, so ETH up, or we're gonna bet that Ethereum is going up. We have a long position. So the ETH bull token is holding $200K. And think of it as debt because you have to go out to borrow it in the secondary market, which is your perpetual futures. Then you have your leverage tokens. Your leverage tokens is worth 150 ETH per token. And let's say the current trading price of Ethereum is $210. So this example is taken from FTX, and I'm just using these examples to plug it into the numbers, into the math, so to give you a bit more understanding and explanation of the math. So how do we calculate net asset value? Net asset value, as calculated in the traditional financial market all the time, is assets minus liabilities. You can divide by your number of equity shares, but we are not talking about that. We're just talking about net asset value as in assets minus liabilities. So the assets that we have is 150 ETH, because each token has 150 ETH, times 210, which is $210 per ETH. That is the price. And liabilities will be the ETH holding. The ETH bull is holding minus 200. ETH bull is holding 200K of futures, which is your liabilities because it's a debt, you have to repay it. So that's your liabilities. So your assets minus liabilities will be 150 times $210 per ETH token minus your liabilities, which is 200K, and you get 11,500. That's your net asset value. Now, what is your exposure then? Remember, our exposure, we always want 3 times. To get exposure is your ETH your ETH trading or your assets, divide by your net asset value. That's your exposure. So your exposure will be, again, 150 ETH times $210, divide by your net asset value, which is $11,500, and you will get about 2.739. So that's about 2.74 exposure. What does that mean? It means that, remember, we want a leverage exposure of 3 times, and now we're only getting 2.74 times. And that means we need to rebalance this entire portfolio or your entire holding so that it gives you your 3 times leverage again. So your rebalance size is really dependent on the desired position minus the current position times the outstanding leverage tokens available. Your desired position is calculated by 3, which is your ideal leverage, so 3 times your net asset value, so 11,500, divide by your current trading price, so 210, which is 164.2. And your current position, so that's your desired position. Ideally, to get 3 times leverage, you need to get 164.2. But your current position is just 150 ETH per token, so it's 150. So your rebalance size is simply just 164.2 minus 150. So your desired position minus your current position times the outstanding leverage tokens. So this rebalance size is how much ETH tokens that it needs to hold extra or less, depending on your rebalancing portfolio, times the outstanding tokens available. So outstanding leverage tokens that's available, because you can't just rebalance one portfolio, you have to rebalance all the different portfolios, and because all the leverage tokens are the same value, you have to rebalance all of them. So it's multiplied by the leverage tokens outstanding. So I hope that helps to explain a little bit more, because of all the kind of videos and content that I see out there, they don't really explain what it is. They don't really dive into the details. And I think the details are where it's super important. Now, what about platform activities? For platform activities, as I mentioned, there are different kind of fees available. So the 3 fees that we're looking at is trading fees. So trading fees is the fees that you get anytime, all the time anyway. When you're talking about trading exchanges, you have trading fees. Then the 2 other fees that's quite new in the space is redemption or creation fees. So every time you create a leverage token, you have to pay your different fees. And the third one is a management fee. Remember, this is something like it's something like having a part of a ETF portfolio or a mutual fund portfolio, and you have to pay management fees. So this management fees comes from the net asset value, and it's a daily management fee of your assets that you hold based on your leverage tokens. So this is just to keep in mind. These are the 3 fees payable on the platform. And the thing about all of these is that it's affected by the time delay or time decay in value. So the longer you hold, the higher the time decay and the less returns you have because of all the fees that you hold. The rebalancing doesn't take into account the different fees payable. So it's just calculating based on the nominal value, and then the real value will be calculated after you remove the different fees. And what about the returns? This is another math thing, which is quite simple. So the returns, as I mentioned, it's a compounded exposure, compounded leverage, which is very fun. So that means if today it goes up by 5%, tomorrow it goes up by 5%, day 3 goes up by 5%, you're taking a compounded movement of that, because all the additional revenue goes back into the underlying asset to maintain the 3 times leverage. So this will affect the rebalancing formula, as I mentioned, because it goes back into your net asset value. And so what does the price movement looks like? The price movement in percentage is as seen here. It's 1 plus 3 times 3, which is your leverage position, times M1, which is the movement in day 1, plus 1 times 3 times movement in day 2, and then again in movement in day 3, minus 1, which is minus your starting position. And that is the change in your price movement of your compounded price movement. So this is good during a bull run, because then you're getting more returns compared to a static leverage position. And lastly, we're talking about the architecture. So the property rights. The property rights, I've been asking this question to many of my finance friends to get understanding and what kind of rights, economic rights are there. I'm not talking about the traditional kind of ownership property rights. I'm talking about just the economic rights. The rights that it gives is that it gives you the access rights of the assets on the exchange. These leverage tokens, I know they give you a leverage position of the long-term petrol futures, but it doesn't give you the rights to own them, because it's more of an obligation to be paying them. So it gives you the right to access the Ethereum's assets that's underlying, or your assets that's underlying your tokens. And lastly, for distribution, because there's no like inflation distribution, it's not a utility distribution. This distribution is really on demand. So there is no distribution per se. If you're interested to buy it, you just purchase it, and it's not distributed automatically, it's a manual way. And it's minted and burnt with on demand. So that concludes the entire token design of how it's being structured. There are a few things that can be considered more going into the financial engineering to reduce the different risks, but I don't think we are at that stage yet. So that is the entire token design. How do you apply it to your project though? That's interesting. That can be fun. It depends. If you are a derivatives exchange, then this is relevant to you because it's a leverage token to give you exposure. It's not so relevant to other kind of token design. So these formulas and this mechanism is not very relevant to utility token, governance tokens, because they have different functions, different objectives to achieve. So if you're a derivatives exchange, derivatives market, you're looking at tokenizing your assets, not tokenizing utility on your derivatives exchange, not tokenizing your currency on your derivatives exchange, but really just tokenizing the security asset itself. This is something that you can consider having leverage tokens. So that's all for today. I know it's quite technical today. It's heavy economics, math, technology, and finance. It's like one of the most dry topics, but I think it's very interesting because a lot of people have lost money on leverage tokens just because they don't understand how to use it. So much so that Binance actually removed it from their products available. Also because Binance math, there is no math. They didn't show anything. It's not transparent. It doesn't give you any information of how it's being calculated, how rebalancing is done. A lot of nice fluffy stuff that's going on, but it doesn't translate into the math. It doesn't translate into logic. It doesn't translate into programmable codes. So leverage tokens is something that's a bit more sophisticated. It's a bit more difficult because there are a lot of variables that needs to be considered and thought about before it goes into your system. And that's why it's fun. So that is for leverage tokens. If you're interested in more basic 101 kind of information, kind of knowledge, then feel free to go to our course. It's the Token Economics Blueprint course, and it's just a 201. I would say that whatever we're talking about right now is more of a 301 or 401. But for a 201, which is more than just the 101 that you see online, you can go to this course. We're having a 10% discount on... Actually, we're having more discount on all the different classes right now. It takes a total of 15 hours. Each class is payable, and you get to choose the kind of class that you're interested in. There's a lot of research and information online that you can get access to get an understanding of the class. So till then, I'll see you at the class itself, or I'll see you in the next episode. Bye!